Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening with Russian oil, and specifically Russian oil tankers. Since the start of October, the USA has ramped up the regulations regarding the oil price cap that's been applied against Russian oil. And as a result of that, we are now seeing an increasing number of tankers refusing to carry Russian oil. So in today's video, we'll have a look at some data on 50 tankers that have all been sanctioned since October the 10th. And you'll see that there's been a huge reduction in the number of those tankers who are prepared to carry Russian oil. We'll then have a look at what's been going on with regards to the tankers that are taking Russian oil to India, because India has reduced the amount of oil that it's purchasing directly from Russia. We'll also have a look at what's going on with Greek shipping, because Greece is the #1 shipping nation in the world, and there's also been a reduction in the amount of Greek ships that are prepared to take Russian oil. We'll then have a look at what's gone on with regards to the revenue that Russia has earned from oil in December. We'll talk about which countries are still buying Russian oil. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary. So what I think is happening with regards to the sanctions, what's likely to happen over the course of the next 3 to 6 months, and what the impact of all of this is going to be on the Russian economy. But before we get started on all of that, once again, I'd like to say thank you so much to everybody that's supporting the channel. If you've bought me a coffee, or sent me a YouTube super thanks, or signed up as a Patreon or a member, then thank you so much. You're really helping to support the channel and keep it going. Really appreciate all of your support. On October the 10th, 2023, the USA ramped up the sanctions that it's applying against tankers that are carrying Russian oil to make sure that all of those tankers have the correct paperwork to prove that the oil that they're carrying has not been sold for more than $60 per barrel. And as a result of this increase in the sanctions, there has been a huge fall in the number of tankers that are prepared to sign up and deliver Russian oil. This chart shows the recent activity for 50 tankers that were all sanctioned on October the 10th. And the scale across the bottom of this chart is simply the number of tankers. So we start off by looking at the top bar of this chart, which shows the tankers that have loaded up since these sanctions were imposed. And what this shows is that 8 of the tankers that have taken Russian oil are what's called shuttle tankers. So basically, these are tankers that are delivering oil to other ships, and they do a ship-to-ship transfer in the ocean, and that oil is then transported to its destination by a different ship. Now, there are 2 main reasons why oil companies use shuttle tankers. The first is when the port in question is too small to accept a supertanker, and therefore the oil has to be transported onto a smaller vessel so that it can dock at its destination port. And the second is to mask the origin of where that oil is coming from. So if you do a ship-to-ship transfer in the ocean, it's much more difficult to be able to keep track of where that oil has come from. And therefore, when the oil is delivered to its final destination, it can be claimed that it wasn't Russian oil. And the pink part of this bar show that only 10 ships have been loaded up since these new sanctions were applied on October the 10th. So excluding the 8 shuttle tankers that we've just talked about, only 10 of the 50 ships have actually taken more Russian oil on, which by definition means that 32 of the 50 ships have not taken any Russian oil since these new sanctions were applied. If we now look at the second part of this chart, which shows those tankers that loaded up with Russian oil before these additional sanctions were applied, you can see that there were 8 of these tankers, and 7 of them have since returned empty or recently anchored and are now stationary. That's the blue section of this chart. And if we now look at the bottom section, which details all of the tankers that have remained idle since these new sanctions were applied on October the 10th, this section shows that 7 of those tankers were actually idle before the additional sanctions were applied, but that an additional 16 tankers are now idle as a direct result of those increased regulations. So if we take a step back and look at the overall picture of what this chart is telling us, it's telling us that there are now far fewer ships accepting Russian oil, and out of those that were previously transporting Russian oil, a lot of them have become idle as a direct result of the increased regulations that have been applied by the USA. And I think this graphic is really interesting, which plots the movement of a Russian oil tanker called NS Leader. Sanctions were applied against this tanker at 2 p.m. Washington time on Thursday the 9th of February, And at the time that those sanctions were applied, the tanker was heading for the Russian Baltic seaport of Primorsk. However, almost immediately after the sanctions were applied, the 817-foot tanker did a U-turn and is now idling in the ocean. And in December, another Russian oil tanker called Viktor Bakiev also performed the same manoeuvre in a similar location after being hit with sanctions. Now, as I mentioned at the start of today's video, Greece is the largest shipping country in the world. It has the most tankers out of any nation and therefore is an important ally for anybody that wants to transport oil. And up until recently, Greek ships were still moving lots of Russian oil. In fact, back in May 2023, it was moving the most. It had 41 vessels that were constantly moving Russian oil backwards and forwards. However, as a result of the tightening of the sanctions, there has now been a dramatic reduction in the number of Greek companies that are prepared to take Russian oil. This chart plots the number of Russian crude cargoes carried on Greek ships dating back to January 2023. And the two different coloured sections here, the black section represents Urals crude oil and the blue section represents other crude oil, so the two different types of crude that Russia produces. And on the right hand side here, we've got the number of ships, with 0 at the bottom going up to 40 at the top. And what this shows is that between January and June 2023, there was an increase in the number of Greek ships that were moving Russian oil. And as you can see, the vast majority of those ships were transporting Urals oil. It's the main export that Russia has. However, since July 2023, there's been a noticeable reduction. And since the new regulations were tightened in October 23, there has been a further reduction. And the current number of Greek tankers that are moving Russian oil is now down to 8, which represents a reduction of more than 80% since May 2023. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll know that India has hugely increased the volume of oil that it's importing from Russia since the start of the war in Ukraine. And at one point, India actually overtook China as being Russia's main trading partner. However, over the last few months, the amount of oil that India is buying from Russia has started to decrease. And if you follow the channel, you'll know that I recently posted a video talking about the fact that Russia was unhappy with the payment terms that India was offering. Initially, India wanted to pay in Indian rupees, which Russia refused. Russia said that it wanted to be paid in Russian rubles, which India refused. And as a compromise, initially India was paying in Chinese yuan. However, the Indian authorities then stepped in and said that they didn't want any of its oil companies paying in yuan, and so a lot of the companies are now paying in United Arab Emirates dirhams as a middle ground. The dirham is actually pegged against the US dollar and is therefore seen as being a good, stable, neutral currency. But recent reports suggested that some of the Indian oil companies were actually struggling to make the payments because the United Arab Emirates banks wanted to see all of the paperwork proving that all of the oil was being delivered for less than $60 per barrel, which is where the price cap is sitting. And interestingly, over the last month or so, we have started to see Russian tankers doing strange things and not making those deliveries to India. This table details the movement of 14 oil tankers that were destined for India over the last couple of months, none of which have arrived. The Beta Metro is carrying Urals oil and stopped sending signals in the Indian Ocean around the end of December. The Jaguar was carrying Sokol oil and started drifting west of the Philippines on December the 29th. The Krimesk was also carrying Sokol oil and was previously heading to India, however is now showing a destination in China. The Lefkada was carrying Urals oil and was anchored off New Mangalore port for a week before discharging its oil. The Litanay Prospect was carrying Sokol oil and was previously heading to India, however is now going towards Singapore. The Nanda Devi was carrying Urals oil and stopped sending signals in the Indian Ocean around the end of December. The Nelis was carrying Sokol oil and was previously heading to India, is now showing a destination in China. The NS Antarctic was carrying Sokol oil and was last seen on December the 28th, leaving the waters off South Korea. The NS Century was carrying Sokol oil and is now idling off the coast of Sri Lanka. The NS Commander was carrying Sokol oil, was previously heading to India and is now heading for Singapore. The NS Lion, also carrying Sokol oil, is idling off the South Korean port of Yeosu. The Sai Baba is carrying Urals oil and is idling around 200 kilometres from India's western coast and has been since the end of December. The Sakhalin Island is carrying Sokol oil, was previously heading to India and is now heading towards China. And the Vostokny Prospect was also carrying Sokol oil and is now drifting off the coast of Singapore. This chart shows the movement in Russia's seaborne oil export revenue dating back to the start of 2022. And the scale on the left-hand side of this chart is shown in millions of euros per day and goes from 0 at the bottom to 600 million at the top. And the 4 different colours that we've got on this bar chart are crude oil at the bottom, shown in blue, fuel oil and slurry shown in red in the section above the blue, gas oil and diesel are in the section above in lighter red, and right at the top we've got gasoline, kerosene and naphtha. Now the overall summary of this chart is that in the first 6 or 7 months of 2022, Russia was doing very well. As you can see, the value of its seaborne oil exports went up during that period. And that was a combination of the fact that oil prices spiked after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The world was concerned about oil supplies. And so the price of a barrel of oil rose above $100 per barrel for the first time in a very long time. And Russia benefited from that overall increase in prices. However, as the sanctions started to be applied against Russia, Russia found it more difficult to be able to find export markets. It was having to offer larger and larger discounts to countries like China and India. And also, towards the end of 2022, oil prices started to come back down as demand started to fall. And as a combination of those factors, in the second half of 2022 and throughout 2023, Russia's total revenue from oil exports fell. Now, as you can see, there were a couple of periods when revenue started to go back up again, and these temporary increases in revenue corresponded with OPEC Plus's announcements that they were reducing the amount of oil that was being put into the international markets. And in addition to the OPEC Plus announcements, the military conflict and unrest in the Middle East towards the end of 2023 drove oil prices back up and led to another increase in Russia's total revenue. And you can see that in October 2023, Russia's total revenue was at its highest point for around 12 months. However, over the last 3 months, Russia has seen a consistent decline in its total revenue. And this is as a result of a combination of the increase in the sanctions that are now being enforced on a much better basis, and also the fact that oil prices have started to come down over that period. And as you can see, Russia's total revenue in December 2023 is the lowest that it's been at any point since the start of 2022. And this really tells us that the sanctions are now starting to bite and have an impact on Russia's total income. This chart shows the largest 5 buyers in December 2023. And the coloured bar charts here show different types of fossil fuel. So the blue section at the bottom is crude oil. The red section are refined oil products such as gasoline and diesel. The light brown section is pipeline gas. The section above that, which is in even lighter brown, is liquefied natural gas. We've then got liquefied petroleum gas, which is a very small section. You can hardly see it on any of these charts. And the black section at the top is coal. And the scale on the left-hand side of this chart is shown in billions of euros and goes from 0 at the bottom to 5.25 billion at the top. And what this chart shows is that in December, China retained its position as Russia's largest buyer of fossil fuels. And as you can see, by far the largest purchase, representing around 3/4 of all of the revenue, was crude oil, followed by refined oil products and pipeline gas, both of which represented around 10%, and coal, which represented the balance. Russia's second largest customer, interestingly, was Turkey, which has overtaken India over the last few months. And in terms of the purchases that Turkey is making, the largest purchase is pipeline gas, which represents around 40% of all of the revenue that Turkey is paying to Russia, followed by oil products, interestingly, crude oil, and then some coal at the top. The third largest buyer of Russian fossil fuels is India, and the vast majority of products that India is buying from Russia relates to crude oil. There is a small amount of refined products, and the reason that India isn't buying a large amount of refined products in the same way as China isn't is that they both have their own refinery businesses. So they're able to buy Russian crude pass it through their own refineries to break it down into things like gasoline and diesel. And therefore, it's cheaper to buy crude oil and do it yourself. And also, you're creating employment and industry in your own country. And then another benefit from India and China's point of view, particularly India's, is that once you've refined that Russian crude oil and made it into gasoline, you can then potentially sell it on to countries that are applying sanctions against Russia, because it's very difficult to be able to prove where the crude oil originated from once it's gone through the refinery process and comes out at the other end as a finished product. So this actually represents an export opportunity for countries like India. They can buy in Russian crude, refine it, and then sell it on at a margin and make some profit. Interestingly, the European Union is the fourth largest buyer of Russian fossil fuels, and around half of its purchases relate to pipeline gas. And this is a legacy issue. Some of the countries in Europe have struggled to be able to replace that pipeline gas that they're dependent on with liquefied natural gas. This predominantly relates to a lot of the countries that are landlocked and therefore don't have a coastline, and so it's much more difficult to set up a floating LNG facility. You have to ask other countries to actually pipe it directly to you. So the EU has given a dispensation to those countries and is therefore allowing them to still buy Russian pipeline gas. The second biggest purchase from the European Union is liquefied natural gas. And this again is another legacy issue. Because there's been such a big increase in demand for liquefied natural gas, it's actually difficult to be able to buy enough of it to keep everybody fed. And so Russia, who does supply some liquefied natural gas into Europe, it has been doing that over the last 20 years. Some of those countries are still buying from Russia because they're struggling to be able to find alternative suppliers. So that again is a legacy issue and a hangover of the previous arrangement. And the other two products that the European Union is still buying from Russia, albeit in much smaller quantities, are crude oil and refined oil products. And again, this relates to supply problems. Some of the countries need to keep sourcing from Russia until they can put an alternative arrangement in place. And then the fifth country on this chart, which is only buying refined oil products, is Brazil. And again, that might strike you as being quite unusual because Brazil has its own oil. However, it has a certain type of oil and it's got certain deals that it's got in place, and it's buying Russian oil because it represents a bargain. It's a good deal from Brazil's point of view, and because they're not partaking in the sanctions, they're perfectly happy to buy from Russia. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I haven't done an update on what's going on with Russian oil for some time, and I think the developments over the last few months have been really interesting because the USA has really started to ramp up the regulation of the sanctions that were put in place over a year ago. And what we're seeing in today's video is that those sanctions are actually now starting to have some teeth. And therefore, the operators of the oil tankers are now having to think twice about whether or not they're happy to keep moving Russian oil. Now, the oil price cap of $60 per barrel has remained static. There hasn't been any movement in that price. And oil prices have obviously gone up and gone down over the course of the last 15 months or so since it was first introduced. But what we've seen over the past few months is that oil prices actually went back up again as a result of the unrest in the Middle East and concerns about whether or not shipping would be able to go through the Red Sea. And as a result of that, the oil price cap started to bite again. $60 was actually a prohibitively low price from Russia's point of view. And so Russian oil companies were trying to find a way around it by changing the paperwork. And what we've seen in today's video is that the shipping companies have said, no, we're not going to keep bending the rules. We don't want the sanctions to be applied against our business, so we're not going to move any Russian oil. And the 50 ships that we talked about right at the start of today's video that were all sanctioned on October the 10th, the vast majority of those ships are no longer moving Russian oil. And as the sanctions start to be applied against more and more of these shipping companies, they'll be told that they absolutely can't move any Russian oil for more than $60 per barrel. That's going to start hurting the Russian economy because revenue is going down. And as we saw from the table right at the end of today's video, revenue in December 2023 from seaborne oil revenues is down to its lowest point since the start of 2022. So that was the time when Russia invaded Ukraine. So the sanctions are definitely starting to hurt Russia. And what we've seen also is that India, who's been one of their biggest buyers, is now starting to reduce its purchase of Russian oil. Now, there's a number of factors for that. Some of it is related to currency. The two countries are still debating what the best currency is to make those payments. But also, when you combine the sanctions on top of that, it's starting to hurt Russian exports. And as we've talked about in previous videos, Russia doesn't have anywhere to store any excess oil. It needs to keep delivering all of that oil to buyers to keep the flow going with all of its wells. And if India does stop buying, even if it's just for a relatively short period, even if it was just for 3 or 6 months, that's going to cause Russia some major problems, because they'll have to start thinking either of offering more discounts to countries like China, or delivering free to some of the countries that it's got relationships with, such as Cuba, or it may actually have to cut back on production. And as we've talked about many times before, if you start tinkering with the amount of oil that's flowing out of an oil well, that can have serious implications for the future, because it's not simply a case of switching it on and switching it off. If oil starts to back up in the system and starts to coagulate and clog, you can have major problems when you want that flow to start again. And because a lot of the Russian oil fields are in really cold climates, that can have some serious implications for what's going on under the ground. So all of this represents a major risk from Russia's point of view. And the overall summary of today's video is that the sanctions that are still being applied against Russian oil are starting to have an impact, and that impact is becoming more important. It's reducing the amount of revenue that Russia is earning. It's reducing the amount of oil that it's able to ship, and that could have serious implications for Russia's oil production in the long term, and that could then have a massive impact on the Russian economy. So the overall summary of today's video is that the sanctions are starting to get tighter on Russia. They're starting to hurt, they're reducing Russia's revenue, and if that situation continues over the next 3 to 6 months, it's going to have a seriously negative impact on the Russian economy in 2024. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.